Those of you who are not as familiar, you'll recognize the 1619 Project. It was a project started by Nicole Hannah-Jones, New York Times journalist, along with any number of journalists and scholars who wanted to re-examine slavery. What I found was, in the midst of the discussion, we're not just talking about like the 1619 Project in isolation. It's that if we really are truly striving towards anti-racist education, we are necessarily trying to re-examine the ways that the current American narrative has allowed it permissible for non-white folks to feel like second and third class citizens in this country, not just personally, but also institutionally. So I kind of had that in mind as I was walking in. And that's kind of what I'd love to also examine, but I can just talk about any number of things if y'all like. Feel free to just chime in. I'm more than willing to do that, as Joe well knows. This wait time is critical, isn't it, Joe?
I can start. Mr. Wilson, thanks so much for being here.
Hi,
I loved
Hannah.
your book. Hi. I was just thinking about, I teach at an independent school here in Nashville, and there was an article, or there was a situation at a school, I think it was last year, but where a student teacher, somebody was dismissed for a lesson about slavery that she did. And so it just made me think when you were talking, you know, it had to do with like, is this developmentally appropriate, you know, the grade, and but she was a Black teacher, and but she was dismissed ultimately for this lesson, you know, that was considered, I mean, people were all up in arms in Nashville, and I'm sure you all have heard of this story, but it just made me think about yeah, just that, I mean, that especially teaching history or social studies, and, you know, and depending on your background, I'm just curious kind of your thoughts on how far to push, you know, kids, because I had this thought of like, wow, you know, like, obviously we're always thinking about you know, how to teach these things appropriately, and but then that appropriateness comes from a certain place, and, you know, is systemic in its own way. And so anyway, I was just sort of thinking about that as you were talking. Yeah.
That is really cool. I thank you for that. Before I forget, Matthew K's Not Light But Fire is a must read when it comes to that specific conversation. He delves into and he does a good professional development around it too, and I've been part of that. He talks about how hard it is to have the conversation around race, because everybody and anybody can get it wrong. And it could go wrong for any number of different ways, right? Especially with the way that American education is set up. It's really hard to teach the controversy because the political, for so many of us, is personal. You could have attacks from the left where people say, well, we shouldn't have reenactments of slavery on any level, and it could be traumatizing or re-traumatizing for so many Black and brown youth. And you could have it from the right where they're like, well, you know, those were our ancestors from a long time ago, and, you know, we're a better country for it now, and so reparations doesn't need to even be a consideration here. It's almost like, okay, we just need to teach the fact that, like, in 1619, slavery in the United States had severe ramifications for Black folks and across this country, and so we need to be able to re-examine that. Like, if that's not even a starting point for people, then that's going to be harder for a teacher who is inevitably an agent of the state. Like, we as educators are, I would say we are standard bearers, aren't we? In that way. I'm going to type in the chat. Thank you, Debbie. So the chat, I'll type it, Not Light But Fire by Matthew K. It's a really good book. But and tell him I said that on Twitter. He's gonna love it. But yeah, so going back, teachers are standard bearers in a really interesting way. Yes, there's so many different folks who have different, like, personalities and understandings about education. But generally speaking, a teacher is someone who was given a position by, whether it be the federal government, state, local government, to instill values seen and unseen to any number of children. Like, that's the general gist. So, and we were given that duty by the state. It isn't like the people just rose up and said, oh, like, everybody needs a free education. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had this debate way early on when the Constitution was being founded about a free and public education. They had their different versions, but generally speaking, like, that's why we are where we are at this point, which is like every child deserves to have a good education, and we as the teachers are supposed to help make that happen. Now, to what extent that happens, it's a whole nother conversation, isn't it? But I think at this moment in time, with all the things that have happened since 1776, it becomes even more important for us to get it right. And then when we know we can't get it right, to at least provide the pathway towards making that happen. So I think Not Light by Fire starts that conversation. I think the 1619 project, which, by the way, is free and available on PDF. If those of you who want to go look at that, it's out there somewhere. There is a free curriculum that does attempt to get it absolutely right, even for white educators. It's all out there, and we could do a better job. And I think this is the conversation we could be having at this moment in time.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Hannah. That was great.
I would jump in with a quick question. I'm sorry about my camera. I've been reading your blog since I was like a tiny little baby first year teacher. It is one of my favorite things to read, especially at the end of tough days. And I think one of the things that I love so much in your writing is when you talk about building relationships with students and culture. As you think about the start of this school year, what are things that you would love to see happening in classrooms with younger students, with older students, as teachers show up to be there with their students?
Oof, I think it's going to be tough because some of the norms that we've established when it comes to teaching children, especially younger age children, are no longer going to be allowed in many ways, right? So we can't necessarily do handshakes the same way. Kids can't just run up on us and hug us in the ways that they would in elementary school. And I know that that's a theme, right? I think also the social distancing is going to be really tough. And, for every conversation we used to have about cooties, I was like times 20 because like cooties are really out there for real. I think that's one element on the surface. I think on a deeper level, though, when it comes to the building relationships, it is evident that educators also need to learn how to be trauma informed. And, I know that's like a theme these days, but I want to get a little deeper. It's not just like, oh, let me just say hi more often to the kids. It's also like, hey, how are you? How are things? How are you feeling? Like what are things that could be helpful for me as an educator to be doing to make sure that you can do well? Those are questions that I think we need to keep probing and asking, and we're not always going to get it right. But, there is this transfer of power now that is going to be very critical in this conversation. Being able to actually ask kids more often how they're doing, how they're feeling, how are they receiving our lessons is really, really important. For every child who we know can do these works independently and maybe just needs to check in with us on a, maybe once or twice a week basis, there are those who are going to need a lot of intensive work. There are, and for all the kids who may relish being at home or being away, there's any number of folks who they needed school as like an oasis, as a timeout from their home lives where they can't always focus in the same way. So those are all things that I think we as educators, period, need to take a good assessment of, is being able to say, all right, before I even step into the classroom, what are the things that I could be doing to remedy the situation? Having better conversations with students, actually asking them how they're doing, being able to say how you're doing as a person, knowing full well that they want to be able to trust you as a person before they trust you as a teacher is a really important part. But that's something that I think a lot of us who did consider ourselves anti-racist, as you well know since you read the book, thanks. Those of us who do consider ourselves anti-racist, we knew way beforehand that this was a thing that was really critical to our pedagogy, being able to actually get to know students deeply and transfer that power over to them so that they can have at least some semblance of like a relationship that really matters to them in our schools. I hope that's helpful.
It was. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Mas.
I coach and teach, so I'm in a bit of a different realm in that I'm not in the classroom every day.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi, how are you? So, sorry. Yeah,
It's all right.
There's a lot going on, and so a few years ago, I coached football, and at our independent school, the football team tends to be one of the more diverse populations on campus, you know, in terms of the community piece. And a few years ago with Colin Kaepernick, I had a few players of color that really wanted to support the Black Lives Matter movement, and they wanted to kneel during our national anthem. And I used it as a really good opportunity to start the larger conversation and, you know, guided them, but kind of put the onus on them and, you know, gave them their voice to kind of lead in a pretty positive manner and to try to educate them on the actual movement. As you know, potentially yesterday, Mookie Betts, who's probably one of the biggest baseball player names out there, publicly said years ago that he would never kneel during the national anthem. And yesterday he kneeled. Right. During the anthem and stuff. And I know a lot of this, we're probably not going to be playing interscholastic sports this year. So the feel around the team, I think, is going to become much more educational based, even more so than normal. So I guess in terms of having these conversations and giving everybody their voice, in years past, I've kind of just played the role of moderator and everything. But for some reason, I feel like there's potentially a little more education that needs to take place first. And as a white person, I'm not sure exactly how to deliver that education piece, I guess.
Wow. I thank you for that. That's really powerful. I think I want to start by saying that Colin Kaepernick changed his protests in order to make sure that he honored his friend who was a military veteran. Right? So we need to recognize that offhand because he didn't want his protest to take away from what his core message was because he knew full well that the political message would be changes to something that it wasn't supposed to be meant to be, right? So here's something, you could actually say something to the effect of, you know, Black Lives Matter, like the movement is trying to address any number of social ills that could potentially infect every single body. So the things that were happening in Portland, for example, in a predominantly white city, right, were things that people have been complaining about for at least the last couple of decades and have protested against. But now we actually have a multicultural, multinational movement that has the same understandings. Mookie Betts came to that same understanding, right, only after a lot of education and a lot of understanding and conversations across different cultures, and knowing how Colin Kaepernick wasn't trying to say, you know, he's against a certain type of people. He just wants to make sure that everyone has the full rights and citizenships that are allowed for everybody in this country. For us to say like that Black Lives Matter, we're basically saying that we want to make sure every single life in this country matters, but they can't matter until we rectify all the things that have happened with all these marginalized groups. I also want to take a point of personal privilege too, right? Because coming from the Lower East Side, I lived with any number of cultures from across the board, whether it be my Jewish brethren, Italian brethren. Like the Lower East Side of Manhattan was at the time that I lived there, just a cross section of all these different folks from like New York City's history, right? And so what I found out through that history was that so many of my elementary school teachers were white Jewish women. And when I went to synagogue, because as a Catholic, I was like, what's a synagogue? Why am I doing that? Then I came out of it like, oh, like honey and apple, y'all really about that. Like, that's dope. Like, I was so excited to have gone to synagogue when, you know, all I had known was Catholic, you know, my Catholic upbringing. But then what they taught me was they weren't always considered white, right? My Jewish brethren were always saying that. They were like, yeah, we weren't always considered white in this country. That's what my teachers were saying. And so they were like, you know, we stayed in this school, even though it became more Puerto Rican, more Black, more Dominican, more Chinese, because we knew full well how important it was to make sure that everybody felt like they were part of this country. Because my ancestors were in the Holocaust, and they were making parallels with the Holocaust and slavery, and like that's what the training that I was getting, right? And I was speaking to so many of the Italian neighbors that we were having like in our neighborhoods, and they say the same thing. How in this country, Italians weren't always fully white, right? And it wasn't until the government said, well, we can reserve any number of spots to make sure that Italian folks get at least some semblance of what it means to be white in this country. Did white Italians become white? Like that was a very real thing as I was growing up as a Black child. And I was like, oh, so like all these different conversations that we're having about Black Lives Matter is really just trying to make sure that everybody feels like a human being in this country, right? And so the more that you can have that, especially in a football team, oh my gosh, like that is a golden opportunity, because that's the point where you get to say, all right, we want to be a real team, right? And yeah, everybody plays different positions in this team, but no one team member is better than the other person. You just all fill special roles to make sure that the whole team can win. And in a similar way, Black Lives Matter is trying to say like, yes, we're all different, but we should be appreciated because we are different. And we need to be valued and honored because we are different. And the more that we can all recognize that so we can build a better team, then we'll do better as a country. You know what I'm saying? So that was such a real powerful lesson for me as a child. I can imagine as like a teenager, like hearing that from a coach is, whew, that would do amazing things. I hope that's helpful, man. All right, cool.
Y'all, we have about 2 minutes left in this room. If there's a quick question, Jose may have a chance to answer it, but we're gonna be airlifted out of here any minute now.
I know how this goes. These Zoom meetings are very stringent. Go on though. Come on, yeah, come on. 1 minute, 20 seconds.
All right, I'll ask another one then.
Love it. Thanks.
I don't want to take more. Just like must read, like going back to school recommendations, like the one you just gave, not Light but Fire, but any other, you feel like most important to like help us as we enter our schools.
Well, as was mentioned, I would suggest educolor.org/resources. They have this book plus all types of books that anybody can pretty much jump into. So let me put that in your chat right quick. That's educolor.org/resources. Yeah, feel free to just jump in that. Like anything that I would recommend is pretty much on there. We have a special section that's dedicated for educators by educators. So folks who are actually education type folks. And then we also have books that are from non-educators who, we would also recommend reading. Other websites like Teaching Tolerance, Facing History, where you could actually delve into these sorts of things. But it isn't just for Black folks, it's also for any number of folks to go get educated about the ways of the world. So I think it would be dope for you to just jump in there. And all the links, I think, are either to IndieBound or to Teaching History. So we were very attentive to independent book sellers if you're trying to go that route.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Of course.
I saw Jose give a keynote at Twitter Math Camp in 2016 in Minneapolis, and I came back from Twitter Math Camp, and the very next day started cohort 1 of the Educators Cooperative with Greg, and those 2 weeks were absolutely transformative to my life as an educator, and I owe Mr. Vilson a great debt of gratitude for being a huge part of that. And thank you all for being part of this important work and important conversation. We will disappear here shortly and we'll be replaced by another facilitator and another one of our panelists from the YouTube video. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
See you in a bit.
Everyone, Christian, you and I will be rotating together and everyone else can remain here. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope your first session was excellent. My name is Joel, and I'm the EdCo facilitator. I am not Sydney. I apologize. She's awesome, and I'm not her, but I'm going to do my best to do as good a job as she did with Ms. Bugs. I want to introduce Mr. Jose Vilson, who, if you were able to watch our YouTube video chat, you're no doubt familiar with. the founder of EduColor and the author of This Is Not a Test, a new conversation, a new narrative on race, class, and education, and a classroom teacher in New York City. Again, just want to remind you of our chat norms, step up and step back. There's a lot of us here, and this is awesome. So let's leave as much time for everybody who has a question or a conversation or a discussion that they want to have with Mr. Vilson. And I'll be quiet now. Let's hear from you. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this.
I want to thank Joel once again. I'll be quick. So something that I kind of wanted to put into like today, and I said this in the other room, but I'll say it here as well, is there's this project, well, excuse me, there's this act, the Saving American History Act of 2020 that was sponsored by Tom Cotton, that says that federal funds can't be used for the 1619 Project, which is from Nicole Hannah-Jones and a number of scholars and journalists who wanted to re-examine slavery in this country. Where I find some of the danger in this act is that when you look at what American history and the way it's taught, right, we who are trying to be as anti-racist as possible have to consider acts like this as dangerous. For all the folks who want to be more anti-racist now, who say that say, oh, Black Lives Matter, all this other stuff, there's any number of folks who are trying to push us back way further than before the Civil Rights Movement, before Reconstruction, and hopefully not back to slavery, right? But there are folks who are perfectly okay with what's happening now and the way that children are being taught, especially when it comes to things like slavery and the things that Black people have been afforded, and for that matter, how white folks have also been taught about what's normal and what's not. So the ways that we try to deconstruct this thing in the face of anti-racism is by saying we want to make sure everybody feels like a human being and that they all are endowed this citizenship. But we can't have that unless we have a full understanding of how all of our children are taught, especially around big incidents like slavery, and how there are still ramifications to this day. So those are things that I'm kind of thinking about right now, but I would love to hear more from everybody here.
There's a question in the chat box. I wonder if Mr. Vilson would like to address the question from Darius Robinson in the chat box.
I don't see it yet.
I can read it to you.
Thanks.
How do we recognize and elevate the talent that already exists in our schools, whose voice on these issues are often suppressed by people who hold power? I think you're a great person to address that question, Mr. Vilson.
I thank Darius for that question. So something that occurs to me is that there's any people who for years now have been ignored and ostracized and fired for having some of the opinions that are now becoming more mainstream, right? The idea that anti-racist educators are all of a sudden coming in vogue is hard to reckon with for those of us who've been doing the work for the last decade and a half, maybe like for the last 40, 50 years, right? I think it does start with understanding the power of your own voice. Being able to be a really good teacher is a critical part to all this. Understanding that like there's gonna be any number of people who try to get you on little things, and so they make those little things bigger things so that they can actually get rid of the much larger issue of you being an anti-racist educator. And then from there, it has to start with community building. It has to also be about not just like the parents and the kids you work with, but also collecting any number of teachers who are also doing powerful work and making sure that you can actually build a sort of collective around what your core issues are going to be. I think squad is so critical. I think it's very easy to just pick off one person, but it's much harder to pick off a whole group of folks unless like you have the broad swath of the institution. And then there's also the part too where even those of us who do get ostracized, hired, fired, whatever have you for our anti-racist practices, we have to play the long game. I think that's one of the legacies that has been left by folks like C.T. Vivian and John Lewis, rest in peace to them, is like understanding that we're not going to always see the fruits of our labor until way after we're gone. That's a hard thing to reckon with because we want to see it, and we want to see it now. And history tells us that unfortunately that's not the case, but we're hoping that we can build those things to get to the point where we can actually be heard, and we can actually be heard well. I think those of us who are trying to build right now, whether it be in the local spaces, you're in Nashville, right? Is that what I understand? There is a Tennessee collective of educators of color who are trying to do real powerful work, if I'm not mistaken. And I think something like that would be really powerful as a narrative to start deconstructing what it means to be anti-racist, especially when so many educators of color have felt the broad, I guess, force of what it means to be anti-racist before Black Lives Matter became the mainstream. So I hope that's helpful. But I think those are the things that we have to start with until we can actually get a really broad movement nationally around what it means to actually help anti-racist educators get their issues to the fore. Thank you, Darius.
I put the link to Tekka in the chat there.
Yes, that's numb. That's numb. By the way, Darius, I feel like I know you from somewhere, but okay.
Yeah.
Anyway,
we've bumped into each other many times.
my guy, of course. You could have just said something. That's cool. Is that you, Min? How's it going? All right. Hi, people. So please talk to me. Mas. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
How about some more strategies for interrogating power systems in your schools? Things that teachers can do to kind of push against those established status quo. I mean, I really like the suggestion of get a squad. I think that's super important to not go at it alone. Have you had other successes with other things?
I think for me, it has always started with kids. And I don't mean, this is the thing too, right? Because a lot of conservatives have to say things like, oh, you're indoctrinating our children. Never mind that our textbooks have been doing that for hundreds of years now, it feels like, right? Being able to say, I build deep relationships with children. I know what I'm doing in the classroom. And I try to make my curriculum reflective of what my students can actually do are real powerful narratives for how to build an actual, I guess, base power in a way that, like, we see now with any number of, I guess, left-leaning candidates. We're talking about like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we're talking about Ilhan Omar, any number of folks, Ayanna Pressley, like folks who are so in tune with the people that they serve that like they're able to get their issues to the fore and make them more mainstream. That's a real powerful way of approaching teaching, even where you're able to say, all right, the kids got me. Like, and so when I've gotten in trouble on a number of occasions, because, you know, I'm me, I've been able to say, like, okay, well, regardless of what you may think about my practice, the kids actually believe in my practice. They don't just like me as a person, they like me as a teacher. And so when I go in there, I know full well that I may get in trouble for putting out any number of topics, but when the kids receive it, they often gossip about me too. And then they go tell their parents, and the community knows about me because of that. And then I'm able to have that sort of space carved out where I say, all right, you don't have to necessarily be me, but the community seems to be responding to my pedagogy, right? And now that I've been doing this for 15 years, there's at least a good 1,000 people out there who've been in my classroom, and they know full well, like, that this is the way that I'm going to approach this teaching. And it would probably be incumbent upon you to try the teaching the way that I'm trying teaching. Because as a math teacher, like, race isn't going to explicitly come up in my curriculum, but it will come up in terms of my pedagogy. Do I believe in children? Do I believe that they're able to actually come up with answers on their own? Are they able to question me in the classroom? Are they able to have the conversations when things go down? Like, when any number of incidents happen, are they asking me questions? Like, these are like the little, like, teachable moments, as they were, but just blown up times 1,000 because they end up being transformational for so many of our children. Like being able to say to kids, I don't always have the answer, but I'm going to make sure that you get to the point where you can have your own answer about this is a real powerful narrative for so many of our marginalized children. And I think those are good strategies, just generally speaking, right? Like that's a good organizing tool to begin with. Being able to feel, well, for kids, being able to feel like they're heard is political enough. But then taking that to the next step, so you say, all right, I value you, I honor your voice, and maybe I disagree with you, but I heard you completely. And now I want to show you an alternative way that may actually help any number of people build up their own space. Those are real powerful ways of approaching this work. So I hope that helps, Alicia.
Hey, this is Ricky Gibbs. I'm a principal here at, hey, how are you, man? Principal here in Nashville. I want to kind of shift the conversation from the work around students to actual adults. As we know, education is predominantly female-driven, but also white female-driven. What
Correct.
can we do as educators, both Black and white, to not only recruit more minorities into education, but when we get them in education, to make them feel comfortable entering into a system where they may end up teaching or working in a school where very few other adults look like them?
That is a great question, Ricky. And I think based on my own studies and the works of folks like Travis Bristol and any number of like, I'm thinking about Marcel Mentor, there's like a bunch of different scholars who do this really critical work. There are things that are going to be out of our control. So for example, we can't always pay teachers the way that they ought to be paid. And this especially matters for teachers who do not have the generational wealth and backing that they need, and often incur generational debt, because for every time that we get maybe a check, we often have to pay that back to our parents or our caregivers, whoever came before us, right? So those are things that always come up in these conversations, is like how often people of color who graduate from their respective colleges or university, they may get pushed up into the middle class, but they also have to kind of pay back for what they've incurred. So the things that we can control, however, start really at the school level and being able to say, do I feel like I belong in the school? I think as a principal, you already have a starting point in that you are a Black male principal, if your avatar serves me correct, right? And so you being able to say, as a Black male principal, I honor and hear your voice even when I disagree with you, is a really powerful statement for you to be able to make. You being able to respond to specific issues around race, around knowledge, because knowledge is also very political. It also seems to me that like for years and years on end, we've always valued certain voices when it comes to pedagogy, but it's rarely the educator of color in that specific context, even when it comes to race. So those are things that really matter, right? Having a leader who says, like, I want to hear what you have to say about this curriculum. I want to hear what you have to say about kids. Like, I see that your pedagogy is different from the teacher next door, but your pedagogy seems to be doing things for kids that maybe the other teachers not, and then they can still both be really good at what they do. Like, that's a powerful statement to be able to make as a principal, right? And then being able to evaluate and actually get a sense of evaluation that is different from the norm, but still is anti-racist, and it serves kids and it serves parents. Those are really powerful things for you to be able to say. And I think that's the way we recruit and retain educators of color, because they often leave not just because of pay, but also because they don't feel like they're being heard, and that their pedagogies are often pushed to the side. And that's a really big deal. I think it really does start with that. And resources are really hard, but we often know that teachers of color often have to go into spaces that are often lack of resource. But I think being able to have an environment that feels like it loves them back, like they'll stay. Or at the very least, they'll be very, very appreciative for the effort that's being put in, versus when they go to spaces that they're not really appreciated in, regardless of what the staff actually looks like. Does that help, Ricky?
It does. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please, Mas. How do we get teachers and administrators who don't yet appreciate the importance of that? Okay, that's a great question. Thank you, Eva. And hi, Eva. I would just say, I think it does have to start with the hearing. I think even, and this is, I guess this is my organizing brain, not the like political ragey activist in me, because I want to just be like, why? Like, why don't you understand, right? Like that I can do, and I've done that all morning. It feels like sometimes, but the organizer in me wants to say, it's good for everybody to feel like they were heard, right? So even the folks who are all about the all lives matter piece, I'm gonna go ahead and hear them. Even the Trump voters, I'm gonna go ahead and hear them, and then I'm gonna repeat what they have to say back to them so they feel heard. And then I'm gonna shift the narrative over to where we need to get to, which is that yes, we do believe that all lives matter, but they can't all matter unless Black lives matter. And then not only that, but then we flip that over and say, not just that Black lives matter, but that they actually feel valued, that they feel honored, that people feel like they're included, um, that their specific understandings may be different from the mainstream, but that like just because they're different doesn't necessarily mean that like they're lesser than, right? Being able to have that conversation is intricate, but it is so critical, because when you're building a team, like that's the thing about teaching that people don't often get, is that we shouldn't try to be competing with one another. If anything, we're just going to come up, a little differently than other folks, because teaching is often a manifestation of who we are as people, and then that orientation often manifests in our own classroom. And so if we're somebody who's different from the next person over, it doesn't make us any less than, unless it's not working for children, in which case, that's a conversation. But the point in that question, I think, is being able to say to ourselves, hey, the kids who often fit into the mainstream narrative about white children feel like they are mostly served by this school. But the folks who are Black, Brown, First Nation, Indigenous, Asian, etc., right? There's a lot of folks who don't feel like they're included in these narratives. What are we going to do? And the thing that we're not going to do is just say, well, they've had plenty of opportunity, and so they should just jump in and fit in. But there's any number of implicit and explicit markers that tell them that they don't belong. So we need to be able to like tease out the stories, and then once we tease out the stories, be able to shift those narratives over to, this is how we're going to actually build a fully inclusive and democratic and I guess unified movement for the whole unit, not just for one specific set of students, but for every single child in the building. I hope that's helpful. I only have a minute left. That's why I stopped there.
There's so much, right? I mean, we could, that's the work. I feel, I know I work in an independent school, and it's so hard to convince everyone that this is the most important work. Jose and I are going to vanish into the ether here any moment, and we'll be replaced by a new facilitator and a new panelist. We want to thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Take care, y'all.
Sorry, I think I lost y'all for a second. I just said use me as thought partners. That's all I got.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks. Bye. See you soon.
Well, hello, everyone. You had the privilege of starting with Claire and Sydney as your facilitators, and I am just not Claire or Sydney, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to do my best here. Those two are fantastic. My name's Joel, and I am going to facilitate this conversation. I'm going to get out of the way as soon as I can, because Mr. José Vilson, activist and teacher in New York City, author, and the founder of EduColor, has so much to say. So I want to give him a chance to start. He's had some really good things to talk about in regards to the 1619 project at the start, and then happy to take your questions. So Jose, happy to hear from you. Thanks for being with us today.
Okay, this is the third time I'm gonna I feel like my introductions are repeating. That's fine. here's this. I think as anti-racist educators, we need to start thinking about curriculum and the ways that they play out politically. Yeah. Those of you who are not familiar, there's this 1619 project that's come out from Nicole Hannah-Jones, I think sometime last year. And it seeks to re-examine what the role of slavery was within our country, and then how it perpetuates oppression to this day for so many Black folks, right? And now Senator Tom Cotton has introduced a Saving American Act of 2020, which forbids the use of federal funds to teach 1619 project, which is of course a farce because most of the curriculum is actually online and for free for that matter. What we need to start thinking about as anti-racist educators is how does curriculum play a part in continuing anti-racist education and for that matter, racist education? And foremost, how do we as educators actually seek to look at our curriculum and our pedagogy and understand the ways that power plays in? We must examine how so much of the narrative around slavery necessarily keeps Black folks, Latinx folks, First Indigenous Nation, Asian American folks from being full citizens of this country in the way that it has been given to any number of different folks who were immigrants, but has not been afforded to so many others. And so that's kind of what was on my thought process today. But of course, I have any number of things that we could talk about today as well. So feel free to chime in, throw your thoughts. I'm here. And of course, wait time is critical.
I had a question I haven't been able to ask yet, if you don't mind.
By all means, Joe.
Yeah, we're going to be returning to school here shortly, and a whole lot has happened since the last time a lot of us teachers were with students, whether that's virtually or in person. And I think there's a lot of teachers that are going to be sort of new to this anti-racist movement and interested in it and invested in it. And I think that is a good thing. But I think also that for someone who's been doing the work as long as you have and as vested as you are, there may be some concerns that you have that those of us who are possibly new to it are just not aware of. So if there's anything like that that comes to mind that you can mention to help people like me or people who may be sort of newer to this movement sort of avoid those missteps that people who are more experienced in this movement can sort of give those years of wisdom to some of us. I hope that question makes sense.
It does. So, and thank you, Joel, for the question. What I would say is this. I think, number one, we have to reckon with all the anti-racist educators who've already been doing this work prior to when it became trendy. Before Black Lives Were Mattering, there's any number of us who've been part of this when, I know I came up through a Black radical tradition. I was blessed to be part of that stuff, and I was learning. And so I came into the teaching profession as an activist in many ways, right? And I've lasted in the profession as long as I have because I already had that mindset. Because, in college, like the first person who heard speak was Angela Davis, right? Even when I was a youth, like I had watched Eyes on the Prize in the Boys Club, and that was an important documentary for me to watch in my youth, so I could fully understand, what was happening in this country. And then there's this other part too, where as an anti-racist educator, like there have been any number of us who've been, harassed, harangued, fired for our beliefs because we believe that Black folks should actually matter, that that we need to have this conversation more thoroughly. And so I laugh about it now, but it wasn't funny on any number of occasions. I'm glad that, I'm in a different space now. The second element is that we are all on this journey, right? And so we're not going to be perfect, whether we do it the first time, the 10th time, the 100th time. I think it's very easy for us to get caught up in trying to be the perfectionist, and for that matter, trying to intellectualize it instead of trying to understand how much personal investment there is in a lifestyle that would be necessarily anti-racist. So for instance, it's hard for us to have an understanding of desegregation if we still want to make sure that our kids get a segregated education. Like our kids need to be separate from those other kids and the social circles that we often have. Like if we can only count 1 or 2 Black friends in our circle and they don't feel the same way about us, then perhaps like we're not as anti-racist as we think we are, right? And that goes for our staffs too. So when our staff is fully dominated by white folks and you only have 1 or 2 Black teachers, and those Black teachers often are labeled as the disciplinarian, as the overseer, as the person who takes care of all the bad kids, then that's a problem too. And that's worth addressing. That's where the personal, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the systematic and systemic actually start connect to all one another, right? So I think that's worthy of keeping in mind, is that so much of this is a lifestyle. It's an approach. It's not just the way that you do it in the classroom. It's also how you do it outside of the classroom. And frankly, how much easier it gets when you make it into a lifestyle than when you just try to do it in your classroom. Like if you diversify your library, but don't do anything to diversify your social circles, then it doesn't really look like anti-racism is at play. It looks like a facade, doesn't it? So those are things that are worth considering at this moment in time, especially in this moment right now.
Thank you.
Did that help, Joel?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cool, man.
Who else? Anybody step up with a question or something you've heard from the YouTube video this week, his work with EduColor? Mike?
Hey, Jose, thank you so much for being here. I
What's
wanted
up, Mike?
to talk a little bit about libraries, and that's the idea of white folks reading. And I would love to, as an arts teacher, encourage all of us to understand that reading Black culture is not just books. And so there are, so we can look at really so much of what my son, who's 13, sees. And I told him last night, we were looking at, it just came up really natural, but I was showing him FAMU's step team, because I said, if you want to know what dance moves you're going to do 3 weeks from now as a white kid, you need to look at 2013 videos of FAM, right? Like that's what's going to happen, because that's the way that hip hop culture has, in my experience as an educator, seen. I used to teach 1 mile away from where my son went to elementary school, and the culture traveled 2 years slower, right? Like so it was really interesting when I taught at a primarily African-American school, just how quickly that culture moved and then how slowly it got to the school where my son went. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about, like, can you talk a little bit about libraries and like visual art, hip hop, and like why that's so important for me, right? Like why that's such a key to connecting with kids, because hip hop, it is no longer, right, the underdog. It is the default culture for most of our kids that we serve, regardless of race.
Wow, that's powerful. So, Mike, thank you. You know what I would say too, like you're kind of giving yourself away with your pronouns mentioned in your box. I'm going to go ahead and acknowledge that. Thank you so much for doing that. I think what you're talking about is the idea of appreciation versus appropriation, right? Is the idea that, like, and this is something too that I learned from my librarian friends, is that the classroom libraries we have aren't libraries, they're collections, right? And so a full-on library would necessarily mean a skill that is, you know, an understanding of how like a library should work versus what a collection would look like in the classroom, right? Where you're doing more picking, sorting, and thinking about that sort of stuff. But then you're talking more about culture. And I think there are any number of literacies that are so critical to understanding what Black culture might look like, what Asian culture looks like, what even Latin American culture looks like. So here's maybe a peek of that, and maybe that kind of helps answer the question. When I wrote my book, This Is Not a Test, I was encouraged at first to just write a book that would rail against standardized testing at the time, that would kind of follow in step with any number of scholars and educators who were talking about like the effects of standardized testing and pushing back against education reform, right? But then when I started to talk to some more of my like anti-racist friends, my Black friends, my folks who are really thinking about this stuff, we all came to an understanding that we can't write books in the same ways that our white colleagues were able to do. So many of our white colleagues get to start from jump with, well, this is the argument, this is why it matters. I start my book with, here's my story, and here's how I got to the point where I got to today. That's a different understanding. And so when you read so many texts out there, whether it be texts that came from the Black Renaissance, you talk about James Baldwin. Like my first reading of James Baldwin was Go Tell It on the Mountain. And then that helped me understand The Fire Next Time, and it helped me understand Notes of a Native Son, right? But I can't get to Notes of a Native Son without having read Go Tell It on the Mountain, right? Because then it gave me a good perspective of what it meant to be in Harlem at the time that he was. We can't say the same about so many authors that are like, I guess white facing, as it were. So when I started writing my book, I said, all right, I'm going to make this so that people understand why I got to where I got to. And then I'm going to go ahead and tell America off about the ways that American education reform wasn't actually working. And so in a similar way, I feel like when it comes to looking at whether it be, Beyonce's Homecoming, which by the way, I am a huge fan of, right? She's basically telling Coachella, hey, like, you're going to make me do this for free. All right, so I'm going to be as Black as possible, as Black woman as possible, and you're not going to do anything about it because I'm one of the most powerful Black women in the world. Go ahead, tell me something. So she starts this thing, and, Coachella's audience like, I don't understand this. Like, these are all the things that I've heard before, but they're just way, way Blacker. And all the Black fans are like, oh, yes, this is great. Like, this is awesome. I can't believe it. You put this out there for everybody, right? Like, we were consuming it. But then, those of us who are Black were like, it's because you were doing this as an act of rebellion because so many people wanted to bury you, right? But then when Taylor Swift ends up doing the same thing about 2 or 3 years later at a award show where she had a marching band, people immediately saw her and were like, wait a minute, like Beyonce just did that because she had a very political message she wanted to get out, and you're doing this because you thought it was just a vibe for you to take and water down and dilute for your own message. So I think those are things that's a literacy, isn't it? It's an understanding that, like, when you look at something, you're trying to read it for not just the words and the expression, but you're also reading it for the context from which it comes. So I thank you for that, man, because that's really powerful for us to all understand.
Caroline, thanks for sharing that in the chat as well. Did you have a question as well around the same time as Mike? Did I see that?
Yeah, I actually had a question and wanted to say hi on behalf of Ronald Taylor, Mr. Vilson. He shared a resource with us, and he said he was singing your praises and said you were an amazing mentor to him, and he's super grateful for that. So, and we're so lucky that he's in our community working with us. And one of the questions that I had to do with I know we're all focused on, okay, in our classrooms, the pedagogy that we're using, how to make that anti-racist, but I wondered if you had suggestions or could point to programs that are independent classes that are being taught at schools that really focus specifically on anti-racist techniques or in how to engage with these in a class that's dedicated to that purpose, if that's something you've seen or recommend or anything like that.
You're saying if I've seen any like after school or independent like programs that are dedicated to like, I guess, training for adults or training for
students?
Kids?
Sorry, for students. Because this is something that, so we teach a course called Seminar on Identity that really focuses on identity formation and sort of bias and things that go into that. And actually, Ronald is going to be helping to head that. So I'm super pumped to learn from him and give credit to obviously educators who have been doing this way longer than I have. But I wanted to know too if that's something that you have seen out there, or do you think the best approach is just everybody in their own classroom spaces?
I would love if we just went school by school, district by district, for sure. I haven't necessarily seen an after school program that is fully dedicated like that, only because, let's call it for what it is. Like, there are very few districts that would actually fund such a thing. And that's real. However, there are programs, if you just type in the word freedom schools on Google, I'm sure you'll find your way. And I think there are freedom schools all across the country that are trying to do this work. for and by kids, with kids. So, and then I should also mention too, that there's any number of youth-led groups and organizations that are out here trying to do that sort of thing too. So I know in New York City, we have about 3 of them that are major: Teens Take Charge, the Urban Youth Collective, and Integrate NYC, that are high school senior led, more or less. So there's any number of resources that are out there of folks who are actually trying to build like kids and their own agency around this thing. I think that's a good resource for you to tap into. But yes, the Freedom Schools are real powerful. I'm seeing Mary chimed in with the National Freedom Schools Partnership. That's the way to go if you're going to look for that sort of thing.
Great. Thank you so much. Another one I would add to that list is Black Students Demanding Change. They have a great Instagram feed too, if you need look into kids doing that as well.
See, a group that just started this year, no? Okay.
It's very recent, at least in terms of the publicity. It may predate that. I'm not positive.
Right. So there's any number of groups like right now that are railing against their own private independent schools too. So like there's like a Success Academy version of that, Uncommon Schools version of that. So like it's disparate, but like the ones that I mentioned are folks who've been around for a couple of years now and have actually like done policy and school work. So, feel free to look into those as well.
Will do. Thank you so much.
Of course.
I dropped a link there. Else? Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mary, for mentioning that. I put a link in the chat as well. We're in that really awkward 2.5 minutes or so left. So if you have a quick question or quick mention that you want, something that Jose can answer pretty efficiently here.
That wait time is so critical.
I'm going to jump in without.
Yes, Mary.
Yeah, I'm on the board of the Nashville Freedom Schools Partnership. So if anyone is interested, I hope that you'll reach out to me. I just would love to. We're looking at trying to offer an after-school year-round program. We're kind of heading toward that. We do a summer enrichment program currently, but so anybody that's interested, I'm going to put my information in the box for you to reach out to me. And thank you so much for your wisdom that you've shared. This has been awesome.
I appreciate that, Mary. And Mike, I appreciate you too, sir. Anyone else?
I'll just say something right quick that
Hi,
you
Nita.
touched upon.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Hi. Just the comparison that you made between Beyonce and forget the other name. But yeah, the Black Lexicon. Go ahead. And the Black Lexicon and how it's almost like people wait for us to put content out there so that they can capitalize on it. And it's always been that way. And it would just be great if there's some kind of way we could can that and make profits from it. You know what I mean? But I love that comparison you made.
And actually, it has a lot to do with what's happening in schools now, where anti-racism education feels like there's any number of profiteers like hovering around trying to get some money off of the anti-racism movement. And those of us who've been doing anti-racism as a lifestyle kind of feel like, oh, so why did I not get that sort of money? So it's kind of wild. But I thank you for that, man, because that matters a lot. Oh, I have 50 seconds. All right, cool. Joel, do you mind? All right, cool. So I can read lips. This is good. Listen, everyone, I want to thank you for taking this journey on. Like, it matters so much. I'm going to just implore you just a couple of things. Number one is go listen to your community, go listen to their concerns, go figure out what they want. That's number one. Number two, go do as much reading and research as possible, please. educolor.org/resources. If Joel can put that on in the chat right quick, has a lot of resources for everybody to read, for educators, by educators. And then last but not least is please act. Please act. Like, the whole point of this moment in time now is like for us to actually do something about what we have in front of us. So I sincerely hope everybody takes that opportunity. I want to thank you for your time and energy. I appreciate y'all. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose.
We're going to wrap it up here. We have just a few seconds on the clock for our hour. We're actually just a little bit over. I think I'm lagging. I'm going to wait 30 seconds while we all arrive. I want to express sincere gratitude on behalf of all the teachers of the Educators Cooperative working together to make today possible. Thank Dr. Erickson, Representative Buggs, Mr. Vilson, and Alicia Ford for their time, leadership, vision, and generosity with us today. It was really something special, and it's the first step. We have to plant a lot of seeds in the summer to tend to all throughout the year on behalf of all of our students who need us to take these risks and are counting on us to do very difficult work and to make our classrooms safe and supportive for Black students, brown students. All students need us to be having these conversations and to feel uncomfortable in this manner. So thank you very much to all of you for your time today, for your questions, for your attention. We're going to take about a 30-minute break. The panel is concluded. We are finished, and I'm so grateful for your time. For teachers who are interested in joining a planning session to create next steps, to name accountability partners, and to share resources, please come back in 30 minutes on this channel. I'll be here, but in 30 minutes, we'll begin with Alicia Ford. Everybody who's here on the line, I will be sharing an email of gratitude, certainly, as well as recordings of the rooms in which you were just a part of and the other ones in which you weren't as you moved around, as well as links to a lot of the resources, how to get in touch with the resources, books, work, hashtags, all the things going on that we're going to need to continue this work. Mr. Vilson's EduColor work is unbelievable, and the resources he has compiled there, the next steps, the available things you can do, it's a great place to start. We have forums on the Educators Cooperative site as well, where we'll be sharing that information. Local plug for Equity Alliance. This is early voting season, and they are doing an incredible amount of work to ensure that votes are counted and people are registered all over town. So if you're here in Nashville, look, their schedule this weekend is chock full of opportunities to volunteer, to get involved, and to make sure that votes and voices are counted. Thank you all. That concludes our panel discussion. Our teaching planning session begins in about 24 minutes here on this channel. If you wish to just mute yourself and hang out, move a little bit, get some blood flowing, it's probably late for a cup of coffee, whatever you want, a soda or something to help yourself. Thank you for your time. I will follow up with all of you with links to the recordings, as well as how to stay connected and continue this work. Thank you, Dr. Erickson, Ms. Buggs, Mr. Vilson. So grateful for your time and attention and leadership. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.